Let's start this lecture with a very simple example. Let's say that you start a business and at the moment you have not incorporated that business, that is, you have not created or formed a company. So you have not formed a company under the Companies Act 2017 to be precise. Okay, so let's suppose that you start a hair salon, and let us also suppose that you have started out as a sole trader, as a sole proprietor, and that this is not a partnership, and of course, like I just said, this is not a company either. Okay, so one fine day, just as you think that everything is going perfectly fine, what happens is that, unfortunately for you and for your hair salon, what happens is that just as the maid or the sweeper has mopped the floor is still wet, and you have forgotten to put up that a board which says caution, which brings or basically draws the attention of customers to the fact that the floor is still wet. And soon after, well, somebody walks in and they slip on the floor and they hurt themselves so badly. That is, the injuries are really serious, they're not minor injuries. Now in this situation, if this customer sues you for the fact that they fell down on the premises of your hair salon, and therefore you are liable to compensate them for the injuries that have been caused. Now this is exactly the kind of situation that you don't want to find yourself in, because even though we all try our best, that is, we endeavor to exercise the duty of care that we need to exercise while performing all business activities, but at the end of the day we're all human, and of course sometimes we do tend to get a little bit negligent. Now, since this situation is one where you are a sole trader, that is a sole proprietor, so what's going to happen is that if, for example, the premises where you ran the hair salon are not your own, let's say that you had rented out a certain place because you're not wealthy or rich enough to have your own place. So there is no property at stake here which can be sold in order to get the damages that need to be paid to this injured customer. And let's also suppose that all of the equipment, the furniture, and all of the items put together that exist in the hair salon at the moment are simply not worth enough to compensate the injured customer. Now in this situation, what's going to happen is that since your business simply does not have the requisite amount of assets to satisfy the liabilities that have been incurred, so it is this kind of situation that I was talking about that you would want to avoid. Why? Because if you are a sole trader, that is a sole proprietor, then the money that is needed to satisfy the claims of this injured customer is going to come from your own pocket. In short, to put it very simply, business का loss यानी कि आपका अपना ज़ाती loss. And for instance, you own a car, that car would also be involved just like any other personal assets that you own, maybe a house for example. All of your personal assets are going to be involved in satisfying the liabilities that your business has incurred. And by the way, this was just a hypothetical example that we discussed. There can be many other situations where a business can go bankrupt, and if you are operating the business as a sole trader, as a sole proprietor, then obviously since there is no concept of limited liability the way there is in a company, and I'm going to come to that in a moment. So just remember that as a sole trader, as a sole proprietor, and the same goes for a partnership by the way, unless it's a limited liability partnership, which we will discuss in another video. But the key point is that as a sole trader, you are not going to be able to escape the claims of the injured customer simply by saying that the business itself alone does not have enough assets to pay off the compensation that is being demanded by the injured customer. Because remember, as far as the law is concerned, the business does not exist as a separate legal entity in the eyes of the law, and the consequence of this fact is that since the business is not recognized as a separate legal person in the eyes of the law, so this means that in the case of bankruptcy, you are going to be held personally liable for paying off the liabilities that are owed by your business. And this, by the way, was also a very simple and straightforward introduction to the concept of a sole trader, that is a sole proprietor. Now, I want you to relate this concept and contrast it with the concept of a company, that is, with the features of a company. And the reason I want you to do so is because only this contrast will help you appreciate the fact that sometimes, even though within a company, all of the shares or maybe the majority of the shares may be held by just one person, and specifically where the situation is that all of the shares are held just by one person alone, then in this kind of a situation, you might want to ask what the difference is between being a sole trader on the one hand and having a one-person company, which is also known as a single member company, by the way, that is an SMC. That is a kind of a private company. You need to look at the types of companies, that is the video where I talk about what an SMC is. But coming back to this topic, I want you to contrast the concept of a sole trader, that is a sole proprietor, with the concept of a company. And the reason I want you to do this is so that you can appreciate the fact that even though there is just one man acting as the person who is running the business in the case of a sole trader, and the same situation goes for an SMC where the same person who owns all of the shares is also going to be the manager of that company. But in the case of a company, and in case you are not aware of the fact that a company is a separate legal entity and that it has limited liability, you need to watch the other videos related to this topic in this lecture series. But to conclude this particular point, the consequences of this difference between a sole trader and an SMC, that is a single member company, is that in the case of a sole trader where you are going to be held personally liable, so that for instance the loss of the business is basically your personal loss. Why? Because in a sole trader, a sole proprietor, you always have unlimited liability, and by contrast in a company, since a company has the feature of limited liability, so in the event that the business does not have enough assets to pay off the liabilities that the company owes, then in this kind of a situation, if the business is being run as a company, that is, it's incorporated as a company, then there will be no personal liability and there will be no unlimited liability, and instead there will be limited liability. So whatever assets can be used to pay off the liabilities that are owed by the company, then that is going to be enough, and your personal assets are not going to be at stake. So even if you own a car or a house, then that personal property is not going to be used to satisfy the claims of the injured customer, if we take our example. But remember that in that example I was using the concept of a sole trader. But now let's presume that instead of running that hair salon as a sole trader, as a sole proprietor, maybe if instead you decided to get the business registered and incorporated as a company, then in the event that somebody gets injured on the premises of your hair salon, then obviously you are not going to be held personally liable if and only if your business is being run in the form of a company.